You're listening to the A3K Network on Anime3000.com. You're listening to the A3K panel with Sean Russell. Joining us on this episode is the crew from Anime Addicts Anonymous to discuss Hayao Miyazaki and his latest film, The Wind Also Rises. This interview was originally recorded just weeks after the 2013 release of his film in Japan. For more information on our guests, visit aaapodcast.com. We're looking at the new Miyazaki movie, which I was surprised that it actually came out, and maybe I'm just missing the chatter about it, but I didn't hear too much about it until you mentioned it on Twitter. And that movie, go ahead and just tell me the name of the movie, just so I have it for reference for the rest of the show.
The movie is called Kaze Tachinu, and the Japanese, the translation for it is The Wind Rises.
And this came out on the 20th, July 20th of 2013. You guys had a chance to watch it, and we're going to be talking about that on this A3K panel. Now, for those of you listening to this podcast, and you're probably familiar with Miyazaki, but hopefully, and I guess the best way to enjoy this podcast is if you haven't seen any of his work, because there's a lot out there. There are a lot of great examples of Miyazaki work, and it'd be interesting to see how that compares with his latest offering. Now, he is celebrated as one of the greatest directors in anime history, whether you agree with that or not. That's just a perception. What is it about his body of work that makes him so successful, in your opinion?
Well, I would say, first of all, the overall quality of the movies is much higher than the average anime. So even if you're not a person that gets swept up in the overall, if you don't, you may not love the story, or you may not be interested in the subject matter, but at the very least, for starters, you're going to be blown away by the visuals. And Studio Ghibli has been ahead of its time. Even way back into the early. If you go back and watch an early '80s movie like Castle in the Sky, even films like that hold up. So I'm impressed. But continually impressed by the visuals of the movies.
I think there is something to be said for his decidedly Western sensibilities in animation, because there's nothing like Ghibli's work, and especially Miyazaki's work. There's nothing quite like it, and it is decidedly Western in influence. Most of his work features architecture that is very, very European in style. very
European.
So.
Kiki's Delivery Service.
Yeah, and aside from the themes that he works with, like environmentalism, which is I think a very Japanese idea,
very
Japanese idea. I think he kind of blends the Western and the Eastern in such a way that catches people's attention, and it has from the beginning. I think that's been pretty clear.
Miyazaki's movies also pack a lot of depth. There have been books written about Miyazaki's work. There's actually an author who studies Miyazaki. Her name's Susan Napier. And you can find her books online where she analyzes and looks at the deeper meaning in Miyazaki's movies. And one of the examples that I mentioned on our podcast not too long ago was Spirited Away, because according to literature and people that have studied the movie, Miyazaki is giving a critique on Japanese society and covers things that happen that are in his mind. He does things such as critiquing the entire Japanese culture and the belief systems, and there's just a lot of depth to be seen there. So not only is it visually stunning, but there's also a lot under the skin there that you can look at, and I think that we see that in the new movie too, which we'll get to.
There's also a book by Helen McCarthy that I would recommend. It sounds kind of similar to that, but she has an interesting perspective on his work, although the only book she has covers up through Spirited Away, maybe. So I don't think she's updated recently, but it's also a really good read.
And one of the main criticisms I hear about Miyazaki is that while all of that stuff, he has all that stuff going on in his films, it sacrifices the actual story. Is this something that you've heard, and what do you think about that?
I think sounds like a generalization. I don't think that's true for all of his work. I think it can be said about some of his things. The more shallow works, Ponyo.
Ponyo.
But admittedly, Ponyo is really a movie for kids, and I think one of the interesting things about following a film like Ponyo up with Kaze Tachinu is that Ponyo is very, very much for kids, so much so that I don't think that adults can really relate to it. I think that's what most people have a problem with. Most older fans of his work have a problem with in that film. But Kaze Tachinu is basically exactly the opposite of that as far as appeal goes.
Completely the opposite.
The one of the first things I read about the film before we had a chance to see it from early screenings was that basically that adults love it, but kids hate it. And that was the only thing that colored my perception of the film before I walked in. But
I don't really. I sort of don't agree with the statement that Miyazaki sacrifices story. I find his stories to be whimsical and engrossing, and there may not be some of his stories may be simple, especially on the surface. A story like Totoro, My Neighbor Totoro can be viewed as probably a simple movie, but something about the way he tells the story, whether it's simple or not, I just feel pulled in by the way that he does it. And maybe it's atmospheric, or maybe it's just the way that he delivers the messages in the movie. But
yeah, I mean, you could say that about Totoro. Ultimately, Totoro is a story it's from the beginning. It's kind of a movie about dealing with death from the kid's point of view. They have to kind of deal with the fact that their mother is dying, and it's a constant throughout the film. But the story itself, the narrative, is so unbelievably simple. It's ridiculous. I mean, I think that's a story to be praised, and the way he tells the story is to be praised. But then you've got films like Howl's Moving Castle, where the film itself doesn't even know what kind of story it's telling, because halfway through it becomes a different story entirely. So, I think to say that his stories suffer because of his, how should I say this? His predilection for storytelling causes his stories to suffer is kind of a generalization that I wouldn't agree with as a blanket statement.
From hearing you guys, and I'm just thinking about some of the movies that I've watched, I do notice that he doesn't direct one type of film. And the films that I find get the most attention are the ones that have a very simple story, but are told through the different artistic choices he makes in the movie, and the themes and the atmosphere that surrounds it. Like Totoro, for example, and another example would be Princess Mononoke, and then you have the more conventional stories that are told through a strong narrative, like Porco Rosso, that I guess would be like a more of an adult themed movie. Is that a good assessment on that particular film?
Porco Rosso is probably I'd say it's more of an adult movie, but not as much of an adult movie as the latest Kaze Tachinu.
And I think go ahead.
I think you're actually getting back to an earlier point that you had, or an earlier question that you had asked about why his films are so appealing, and I think that it's that he is aware of the breadth of his appeal, and he makes movies for everyone. So maybe if Ponyo is not for you, maybe Kaze Tachinu is, and if it's not for you, then maybe something like Porco Rosso is, or something that's a little bit of childishness and a little bit of maturity, or the opposite. I think he makes movies for everybody, and I think that's why he's been so successful as a storyteller and a filmmaker.
Well, many decades later, he's coming out with a brand new movie. Eventually, everyone listening to this podcast will get a chance to watch it, because I doubt that we will not be deprived of a Miyazaki release over here. So, Kaze Tachinu was recently released in theaters in Japan, and I skimmed Wikipedia in preparation for this podcast just to get a little glimpse of what this movie is about. but you actually seen the movie. So why don't you let us know? Just give us a synopsis of what this movie is about before we start talking about it.
Kaze Tachinu is a biographical film that covers the life of a man named Jiro Horikoshi, who was the head engineer responsible for developing the design and the creation of the Zero Fighter, which was probably one of the most famous aircraft used during World War II, the Japanese aircraft. So the movie covers his life from childhood, which is full of dreams of creating a beautiful aircraft and the dreams of flying and his passion, and follows his life through into adulthood, where he actually goes through the process of creating an aircraft and, failing and picking himself back up and trying again, because this was still an experimental thing. So it took several failures of, crashed airplanes and things like that. And then there's also some romance in there. So it really is about the man's life. And
well, it's a fictionalized account.
It's a fictionalized account,
really about his life.
But it's also about airplanes.
Yeah, there are lots of airplanes in this movie.
Yeah, did we say there were airplanes in the movie yet?
Flying sequences and airplanes, and
Miyazaki sort of loves airplanes. And I do want to say that probably a point that I should mention up front is that I was looking into it, and according to Nausicaa.net, Miyazaki's own family owned a company which produced the wingtips for the Zero Fighters. So that's an interesting point to add, and maybe why Miyazaki loves airplanes so much. And if you think about his old movies, more than almost all of his movies have some fantastic flying sequence in them.
it's easier to count the movies that don't have a flying sequence.
There's maybe 2 movies out of the how many has he directed now? 11 movies.
Something like that.
So
okay. And what are you any of you I don't even know what's the term called, a fan of planes?
Oh, not really.
yeah, not really. I'm a fan of Miyazaki.
I'm actually kind of terrified of planes, actually. So,
Are you really?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of flying.
Are you afraid of flying?
Yeah, I don't really like it.
How did you get to Japan?
Well, I came here and I haven't left.
Swam.
Maybe that's why I've been here for 3 years.
Yeah, but what did you think about the movie not being I just want to insert the word, but I'm a fan of airplanes.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that Miyazaki's done in his other movies that I'm not necessarily a fan of. I don't really have any fandom towards bathhouses. I don't necessarily have a fandom towards witches or giant critters and forests of gas. But he manages to tell those stories in an interesting, engrossing way. And so even if I'm not a huge fan of airplanes, I always go into a Miyazaki film thinking, wow, maybe I'll love airplanes by the end of it. And Porco Rosso sort of delivers that. I guess this is sort of the second direct airplane movie.
Yeah.
And I loved Porco Rosso despite not being a huge airplane fan, so I went into it not really being concerned about that, and I don't think my lack of love for airplanes really had an impact on how I felt about the movie at the end of the day.
I think it is really obviously his most personal film, though. Like, it's obvious that he is just watching the film, if you didn't know anything about Miyazaki, I think it's pretty clear that he has a passion for basically the same things that our main character in the film has a passion for. Just with the way he treats the subject matter, and
maybe Miyazaki is the main character.
Oh, well,
we'll get into that.
I
maybe
actually do think he is, but
and what are some things did he introduce anything new in this film that you haven't seen him before? Anything new or maybe experimental for Miyazaki in this film?
Yes, an implied sex scene. First for a Ghibli.
There was an implied sex scene. Yes, there was. That's true.
But
hey, it's not a kids movie.
Yeah, totally not.
That's an interesting
something
question. And
experimental. I don't think there's anything really
Yeah.
I don't think that Miyazaki has a history of experimentation in his works. I think that's kind of the realm
Well-
in Ghibli. I think that's kind of the realm of Takahata. Actually,
I want to maybe step back and look at that question from a higher view. So I'm just looking at the list here of Miyazaki films, and nearly all of Miyazaki's movies have some kind of fantastic element in them. So you've got Princess Mononoke, clearly fictional. You've got Kiki's Delivery Service, Flying Witches. We have Flying Pigs. We have Spirit Bathhouses. We have Armies of Ohm trampling human cities. We have Totoro. And then we have a movie that is about as set in the real world as humanly possible. And I would say that maybe he's experimenting with a more directly non-fictional movie.
yeah. I mean,
So-
it is historical fiction, but it is certainly not a fantasy. And I think that
Definitely
basically
not.
all of his other movies could be placed in the fantasy genre.
He really is stepping into Isao Takahata territory with this movie. Yes,
in that
very much.
he's telling a more human story than than like a very broad fantasy epic.
I wonder if he went to Takahata and said, if you could make a prequel to Grave of the Fireflies, how would you do it?
I don't think Takahata would have made this movie. I don't think it would have been like this.
Probably not.
And that's interesting that you did bring up Takahata, because we didn't really talk about Ghibli as much in the first part. Ghibli is more than just Miyazaki. A lot of people who don't dig a little bit deeper into the hype that surrounds Miyazaki might not realize that. Just briefly, and we can be here for hours talking about Isao Takahata. What is his contributions to that studio? I mean, what are a few of his contributions to that studio, and how does he help shape the culture that is Studio Ghibli?
Well, he was one of the founding members of the studio.
He was a co-founder.
So I guess you could say maybe without Takahata, Ghibli wouldn't exist. In terms of content, I always feel like Takahata sort of, for the most part, deals with more realistic storytelling and stories that are generally geared more towards adult viewerships.
I think he kind of keeps the studio's body of work grounded, whereas Miyazaki can kind of go on his flights of fancy and make his, like I said before, kind of sprawling epic fantasies. Takahata tends to do films that feel more like personal passion projects. And he has the freedom to do that as a co-founder of the studio. And I think some of the studio's best work has come from Takahata himself. We actually, on our podcast, we recently ranked all of the Ghibli films, and
Yes,
the top three.
Yeah, in episode 186 of the Anime Addicts Anonymous podcast, we ranked all 20 Ghibli movies from the bottom to the top, and then we slid Kazetachi Nu into the listing to kind of give it its own ranking. And I don't want to say what the top three were, but two of the top three were Takahata movies.
Yeah.
But I totally agree. I totally agree with your point. I almost said, really, there's someone else in Ghibli besides Miyazaki, because people don't seem to know that, and that's a shame. But Takahata does a lot of screenwriting for movies, and especially he does a lot of producing for the Ghibli movies. So definitely influential. And they have a new director that's up and coming, Yone Bayashi, who directed the Karigurashi, The Borrower's Ariete, which I loved.
Oh, you don't mean Goro Miyazaki?
I forgot about Goro Miyazaki.
As the up and comer. Poor Goro, he gets a bad rap.
Yeah. His own fault, yeah. Okay.
All right. And so right now, another point that was very interesting to me, and maybe I just wasn't looking in the right locations. There didn't seem to be a lot of hype, at least on our end, behind this movie. It didn't seem to be a lot of hype. I mean, the first time I heard about the movie coming out was from you. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you think that there was hype and I just didn't see it?
There was some hype in Japan. There was certainly some advertising. I saw advertisements in trains. I saw it in magazines. I know that it was on TV and other places. But even amongst people, I would say, oh, there's the new Kaze Taichinu, and every single person I mentioned it to already knew. So here in Japan, from through whatever media outlet they consumed the advertising, the people here knew about it.
They actually, it had been announced and people had been aware of it for, I guess, more than a year now, because I had heard about what was supposed to be the double feature of this and the Kaguya Hime story that is Takahata's new film, which actually got delayed. It will be coming out in the fall now. But I had heard about this more than a year ago. And the one thing that was interesting, one thing that might contribute to the lack of hype around the film is that there wasn't a full-length trailer for this until the day before it came out.
I find that to be so odd.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And I think something that that you're probably going to see stateside once this starts getting its distribution, which Disney, I'm sure, will handle.
Yeah.
I don't think Disney's going to know what to do with this.
I agree. I was going to say.
Yeah.
I think they actually parted ways with Disney. I think they're now being released through like Cinedem or some other company. At least that's the last time that I've heard. The latest one, Ghibli film, wasn't even released by Disney.
I was not aware of that.
I hadn't looked into that, but for people that consume the movie in America or in Europe or in the West, just based off the Miyazaki name,
that's what they're going to have to. I mean, I have a feeling that's what they're going to be leaning on. It's just the Miyazaki name, because it doesn't feel like a Miyazaki film. Like, I don't think you can market it to feel like a Miyazaki film without just saying, hey, it's a new Miyazaki film, so go see it. You like his other stuff, right?
One of the big comments I made after I watched the movie was that people who love Miyazaki's prior films and people who expect there to be a fantasy element, and quite frankly, a female lead character, which is so typical for Miyazaki, those people are really going to be stunned by this movie. It's not a fantasy movie. There is no main female lead character, and it really won't feel like your typical Miyazaki film. And I really feel like Miyazaki sort of stepped out on a ledge and tried something completely unique with the way that he told the story. And I mean, he could have done what all the rest of anime does and made the historical male figure a 7-year-old girl like Oda Nobunaga.
So I did want to jump back a little bit and talk about like how this is different from his films, because before I had said that this was really it feels like his most personal film. Not to say that it's his best film, but it certainly feels like the closest thing to him as a person he's ever made. I think the subject matter, like talking about his love of planes, I think the subject matter actually allows him to display his love for flying machines more prominently than he ever has before. But he doesn't use that opportunity to create really big, over-the-top flying sequences. I think there are other movies that have like the more bombastic flying sequences in his body of work. And consequently, the flying sequences are kind of graceful and tactful, and they exhibit a respectable amount of restraint from the filmmaker that I don't think he, of course, as director, he has creative control ostensibly, and he didn't have to do that. But the flying sequences aren't super impressive.
Well, maybe he's trying to make them more realistic. I mean, these are the first airplanes that Japan had, and they're not going to be doing like barrel rolls and triple backflips like Porco Rosso, and they're not going to be having I think it fits the whole movie to make the flying scenes more realistic.
And even like little details, like the main character smokes the same brand of cigarettes that Miyazaki does, cherry brand cigarettes. I think that's kind of telling. And even like his work ethic, like as a character, everyone knows that Miyazaki's kind of married to his work and hasn't exactly been the greatest father or husband over the years, as kind of he's admitted and has been talked about by his son Goro, since Goro has kind of come into the spotlight, directing his own features. But just like Miyazaki, Horikoshi seems to have a problem keeping promises with his family. But in the film, they kind of play it for laughs. Like you don't really see him interacting with his family other than his sister, and she's kind of cute in an angry way, like, "Oh, you never come to see us," and he's like, "Oh, I know, I'm so crazy, and I'm always working, aren't I?"
Her only purpose in that movie was to deliver that message.
Yeah, basically, like every scene that she's in, she's talking. I mean, that's her only purpose is to be like, "You never see us. You're wasting too much time working. You're a workaholic," which sounds like Miyazaki, but Miyazaki isn't willing to really indict himself in this film because he plays it all for laughs. It's not a character flaw, and I think that that kind of leads into a common problem among biopics in general, and that's like the overwhelming praise of its subject matter, like of the core of its subject. In this case, the main character.
So you thought the main character was flawless?
I think that Miyazaki kind of painted him as a flawless character. That's part of my problem with him as a character. I think the beauty of a true story should be on some level the fact that it's a human story and humans are imperfect creatures. And when I see a movie about a real human being that lived and breathed, I want to see that person warts and all. I don't want to see this kind of false, over positive image. And I think that's what we get too often. And this is exactly what that is.
And you mentioned earlier that it looks like Miyazaki inserted himself into this character. Do you see this as being his statement to the world about all the criticism that he's faced, as far as being his personality and some of the things that he's done? And also, can it be read as maybe, one of the last things that he might put out, almost sort of like, hey, this is who I am. Here's the reality of what I think and I feel. And I know you enjoyed my body of work. Here's what I'm interested in. Have a good day.
So are you asking if Miyazaki's sending a message to the critics?
Sending a message to the critics saying, here's my answer to all the questions that you had about me in the way that I answer things, and I'm done, but not making it a big deal.
Cram, do you think that Miyazaki cares what the media thinks?
I don't think he cares what the media thinks, but if he's trying to send a message, I don't think he's sending a very honest message. And that kind of goes back to, I don't think he's very good at creating an interesting character. I don't think he's willing to indict himself as a person and really talk about what makes him an imperfect creature. Because this character that is obviously Miyazaki is kind of a perfect creature.
Ostensibly.
Yeah. So,
could it be that he views himself as a perfect creature? That's why he escapes into fantasy in most of his films.
I can't say.
I'm not.
I know. I mean, just obviously, I'm not looking for like the official statement from his press agent, but just like, how do you?
Well,
I can't read that much. I can't read that far into it. I can't read into it and see what he thinks of himself. Well, I see what he's willing to put out there, and I in my opinion, I think it's a dishonest message.
What I do know is that even back when they did the documentary about Miyazaki's process of movie creation, what was with Ponyo?
Yep.
He was basically in complete resistance towards even having anybody follow him with a camera, and didn't want to be a part of any kind of media. So my personal opinion about Miyazaki is that I can't really see him caring about or even reading anything about himself. I don't know for certain, but just based on that and how serious he is as a person, don't really know that Miyazaki would care. And plus, he's received an awful for the criticism that he has received. He's had a lot of praise too, including an Academy Award. So,
and tons of Japanese film awards,
and the love of 130 million people in Japan. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
So, I mean, maybe I'm just trying to read too much into it. So, kind of closing out, you've mentioned and skimmed over, not really skimmed over, but kind of tapped a few of his other films. For people listening to this, they're probably excited, but they don't live in Japan, so they're going to have to wait a little bit. What would you recommend that they should go out and check and watch? What should be on their must-watch list to kind of get ready for this film, just to kind of get a glimpse of what Miyazaki offers to the world of animation and movies?
Well, if you're looking for the best of Miyazaki, but I don't know that I'd want to steer people towards a false expectation.
If I was going to choose one movie of Miyazaki's for them to watch before they watch this, probably Porco Rosso.
Porco Rosso, because of all the airplanes,
yeah,
and
just kind of similar-ish subject matter. But even then, I think Porco Rosso is a more entertaining film. Much more.
Yeah, because this movie's so different from his other movies, I'd almost feel like it was misleading people if I told them that they could prepare for this film by watching his other movies. So if you were to ask me what is Miyazaki's best movie, well, there's a lot of them, but a lot of people would say Princess Mononoke. But that movie is so starkly different that people aren't going to... I don't want people to go into Kazutaichi Nu expecting Princess Mononoke because of how different it is. You'd almost get a more adequate, more accurate preparation if you watch some Takahata movies.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate.
And interestingly enough, even though it would pain most people to do it, the movie that's probably in the same general vein as Kazutaichi Nu is probably Grave of the Fireflies, because they're both they have World War II themes in them, and they take place in the same 15 to 20 year period of time. And they're both mostly nonfiction.
So you'll get that same Ghibli feel, this Ghibli aesthetic, I would say. Not exactly, but and you will kind of be introduced, like this introduction to the world that is Studio Ghibli. I think you would say Grave of the Fireflies would be a good place to go.
Grave of the Fireflies, I think, is a good transition. Is a good movie to watch before Kazutaichi Nu, maybe. But Grave of the Fireflies is a really sad, serious film, and I don't want people first time Ghibli watchers to watch Grave of the Fireflies and expect that that's what all of Ghibli is like.
Yeah, be forewarned. It's one of the greatest films ever made, but it's probably one you're only going to watch once.
If people have to be introduced to Ghibli and want to have some Ghibli exposure, I would say you should go watch My Neighbor Totoro, because it's probably one of the most famous movies in Japan, and Totoro is a character that everybody in Japan knows, and it's Ghibli's mascot. So, My Neighbor Totoro is a good place to start, and for people that have already seen that, maybe Porco Rosso because of the airplanes and the overall fun.
So Grave of the Fireflies, My Neighbor Totoro, and Porco Rosso.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice balance. Even though when you really dig deep into My Neighbor Totoro, it can be very depressing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Mitsugi agrees with my take on Totoro.
I don't even want to get Cram started, because to me, Totoro is a fond childhood memory, and I don't want to think of Totoro as the god of death or whatever people seem to think.
The bus carrying souls to the other side, whatever.
That's right. Oh, he knows what's up.
It can't be true. It's lies.
But I want to thank you guys so much for talking about Miyazaki. Obviously, we could spend 14 podcasts going all over the world of Studio Ghibli. What's going on with your podcast? Let us know all the great stuff that people can expect if they go over to your website and check you guys out.
Well, you can find us we're the Anime Addicts Anonymous podcast. We just had our 4th birthday. You can find us at www.aaapodcast.com, and of course iTunes and Twitter and all the typical sources like Facebook. We do a live podcast every Sunday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can get links to generally all of that on the main website. And our podcast covers a wide variety of topics. We tend to cover generally all of the new anime that comes out each season. But we also go back and look at older shows that have come out, and we'll do things like ranking all the Ghibli movies in preparation for Kazutaichi Nu, and we've done a lot of interviews with voice actors like Steve Bloom and manga artists, and we're gonna have a man from Gaijin Pot, the Japanese employment agency website, come on and talk to people about finding jobs in Japan and delivering people a wide variety of anime-related topics and content. So,
and how has your podcast changed since you've personally moved out to Japan?
That's a good question. First, I would say that we're a lot closer to the source of news, so we can do things like going to the premiere of Kaze Taichi Nu, or interviewing a mangaka who worked on various manga, and we can do things like go to the and when we were in Florida, we went to a lot of Florida conventions and to Otakon and covered things like that. But in Japan, we've gone to the Tokyo Game Show, and of course, there's the huge doujinshi convention coming up, Comic-Cat. So being closer to the source sort of lets us, I think, give a more accurate, hands-on approach to the world of anime, and provides new time zone challenges for everybody.
Well, and Cram, anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, that pretty much covers it. I think you did mention the Twitter. We are also posting pictures from Japan on the podcast Twitter that can be found @AAA podcast, and I'm also doing that from my personal Twitter. You can find me @DustyCram.
Yeah, whenever we see something crazy in Japan that people should see, we post it on Twitter. So lots of anime related stuff.
Yeah, it's a good way to get in touch with us too if you have questions about the show or comments or anything like that.
Yeah, of course.
All right. And thank you guys so much. And one last time, it doesn't hurt for repetition. What is the website again?
www.aaapodcast.com. Stands for Anime Addicts Anonymous. So come check us out. We have a forum, and we like to hear from people that listen, and it's a lot of fun. So stop by, say hi.